David and Laura lived what seemed like an ordinary life in a quiet suburban neighborhood. They had been married for 3 years, and in that time, they'd built a life together that many would consider picture-perfect. They had a modest home, 2 newborn twins, a little girl and boy, and a life that, to anyone on the outside, seemed filled with love and happiness. David worked long hours in an office job, managing the day-to-day operations of a tech firm. He often came home late, his eyes tired from the demands of the corporate world, but always managed to smile at Laura when he walked in through the door. Laura, on the other hand, had chosen to stay home with their twins. It wasn't an easy decision. Being a new mother was challenging in itself, especially with twins, but it was one they had agreed on. She found joy in taking care of their children and managing the house, and David, in his own way, appreciated the sacrifices she made. They were partners, each doing their part to keep their little world running smoothly. But as the days passed, something seemed to shift in David. It was subtle at first, a slight distance in his eyes when he spoke to her, a change in his tone when they had dinner together. At first, Laura thought it was just the stress of work weighing on him. But as the days turned into weeks, the change became more evident. It started with the small things. David would come home later and later, claiming that work was demanding more of his time. At first, Laura understood. His job had always been a source of pride for him, and she never questioned the long hours. But as the weeks went by, she began to notice that even when he was home, he wasn't truly present. He would sit on the couch, eyes glued to his phone, texting or scrolling through social media, barely acknowledging her or the twins. It was as if his mind was elsewhere, and no matter how hard she tried to engage him, he seemed more distant with each passing day. Laura tried to brush it off. She chalked it up to the pressures of life, the stress of raising newborns. The pressure of work. She tried to be understanding, offering him the space he needed, but it only seemed to push him further away. She began to wonder if there was something more at play, but the thought was too terrifying to entertain. Could he be losing interest in her? Was he feeling trapped by the responsibilities of fatherhood and marriage? As the tension in their home grew, so did Laura's sense of unease. She didn't want to admit it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was as though she could sense the weight of a storm cloud gathering in the distance, but she couldn't quite see its shape. Everything was shifting, but she couldn't pinpoint why. One evening, after the twins had finally fallen asleep, Laura decided to confront David. She had waited for the right moment, but the more she waited, the more the distance between them seemed to grow. Sitting across from him at the dinner table, she noticed how tired he looked. His eyes were dark circles beneath his eyelids, his shoulders tense as he hunched over his plate. She had seen this look before, back when they were dating and he had pushed himself too hard at work. But this time, it felt different. There was something about his demeanor that seemed more closed off, more guarded. "David, what's going on?" Laura asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been distant lately, and I can't help but feel like something's wrong. Is it work? Or is it something else?" David paused mid-bite, looking up at her with a blank expression. He didn't immediately respond. For a moment, the room felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Laura's heart raced, her palms growing clammy as she waited for him to speak. "I'm just stressed," David finally said, his voice flat. "You know how it is. Work's been crazy, and I'm just trying to keep up." Laura nodded, but deep down, she knew this wasn't just about work. She had seen him stressed before, but this felt different. There was an underlying tension in his voice, an unspoken frustration that seemed to grow with each passing day. But rather than press the issue, she simply said, "I understand. But you've been like this for weeks now. And it's not just work, is it?" David didn't respond. Instead, he looked down at his plate, pushing his food around without eating. Laura's chest tightened as she watched him. She wanted to reach out, to ask him to open up, to tell her what was really going on. But something held her back. It was as though she could already sense the answer, even though she wasn't ready to hear it. The next few days were filled with a tense silence that hung over their home like a thick fog. David's late nights continued, and Laura was left to handle everything on her own. She fed the babies, changed their diapers, and soothed them when they cried, all the while trying to hold on to the hope that this was just a temporary phase. But deep down, she feared it wasn't. One evening, as David was leaving for work, Laura stood by the door, the twins cradled in her arms. She tried to smile, to pretend everything was okay, but her heart wasn't in it. David kissed the babies on their foreheads, his expression distant. As he moved to leave, Laura reached out to touch his arm. "David," she began, her voice trembling. "Can we talk? Just for a minute?" David didn't stop, didn't even look at her. "I'll be home later, Laura," he said, his voice cold and detached. "We'll talk then." But Laura knew they wouldn't. The conversation she so desperately wanted to have would never happen. David had already shut her out, and there was nothing she could do to change it. As the days went by, the tension only worsened. David's behavior became more erratic, more unpredictable. He would go for long drives without telling Laura where he was going, sometimes not returning until late at night. When he was home, he seemed restless, always fidgeting, always looking for an excuse to leave again. Laura's worries deepened. She couldn't understand why her husband was acting this way, why he seemed to be slipping further and further away from her. It wasn't until a week later, when David came home early one afternoon, that the full extent of his actions began to unravel. He had a strange look in his eyes, cold, distant, almost as if he were a stranger in his own home. Without saying a word, he grabbed a bag from the closet and began packing it with clothes. "Where are you going?" Laura asked, her voice shaking. "I need to get away for a while," David replied, not looking at her. His voice was emotionless, as though he were talking about something trivial, like running errands. But what about us?" Laura's voice cracked. "What about the babies?" David paused for a moment, then turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, his face hard. "I can't do this anymore, Laura. I'm done." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She staggered back, her knees weakening beneath her. "What do you mean?" "Done with what?" "I'm done with this marriage," David said flatly. "I can't live like this. I need out." Laura stared at him, the world around her spinning. She tried to speak, to beg him to reconsider, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was watch as David walked out of their home, leaving her and their children behind. Her mind raced as the door slammed shut. What had just happened? Was this the man she had married? The man who promised to love and protect her? How could everything change so suddenly? In that moment, Laura realized that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. She had just been abandoned, by the person she trusted the most, by the person who had vowed to be there for her, through thick and thin. And as she stood there, staring at the door that had just closed behind him, she couldn't help but wonder how she was going to survive the storm that was about to hit. The door slammed behind David, leaving Laura frozen in a moment of disbelief. The emptiness that filled the space was suffocating. She stood there, still holding their twins, the babies oblivious to the storm that had just torn through their family. The harshness of his words echoed in her mind, and she could hardly comprehend what had just happened. David, the man she had loved, the father of her children, had just walked out without a second glance. As she stared at the closed door, Laura's heart shattered. She had no idea what had gone wrong, how it had escalated to this point. The past few weeks had been filled with a growing distance between them, but this sudden abandonment, this harsh rejection, was beyond anything she could have imagined. She tried to reason with herself. Was it something she had done? Had she failed him somehow? But deep down, she knew this wasn't about her. David had already made his choice, and in that choice, he had abandoned their family. Tears welled up in Laura's eyes as she held the twins close to her chest. They cooed, their tiny hands reaching up to touch her face, their innocent gaze completely unaware of the chaos surrounding them. She kissed their foreheads, trying to calm the storm inside her. But there was no comfort, no solace in the moment. Her world had just crumbled, and there was no one left to hold her up. The days that followed were a blur. Laura was left to pick up the pieces of a life she had never imagined could fall apart. David's absence loomed large in their home. His clothes were still in the closet, his things scattered around, reminders of the life they had once shared. Every corner of their home felt empty without him, and every room seemed to echo with the quiet pain of betrayal. For the first few days, Laura's mind raced. She tried to understand what had led to this moment, but there were no answers. David had been distant for weeks, but she never imagined it would end like this. He had made a decision that left her alone, vulnerable, and terrified. She wasn't sure what to do next. She couldn't go back to her parents, she had never wanted to burden them with her problems, and besides, they lived hours away. There was no one she could turn to, no one who could understand the depth of what had just happened. It wasn't just the abandonment that hurt, it was the suddenness of it all. One moment, David was there, a part of their lives, and the next, he was gone. The twins needed their father, just as much as they needed her, and Laura knew she was now facing an overwhelming task alone. It was daunting to think of raising 2 children without the support of a partner, but she had no choice. She was their mother, their protector, and she had to step up, no matter how difficult the road ahead would be. As days turned into weeks, Laura tried to put on a brave face for the twins. She cared for them the best she could, even though exhaustion weighed heavily on her. The sleepless nights were grueling, the endless demands of motherhood overwhelming. There were moments when she felt like she was drowning, and she couldn't catch her breath. But through it all, she never gave up. She couldn't. She had no other choice but to keep going, to push forward for the sake of her children. But the pain of David's departure was never far behind. It lingered like a shadow, creeping into every corner of her life. The moments when she thought she could forget, when she thought she could focus on the present, were quickly interrupted by memories of their life together. The life they had built, the love they had shared, all seemed to vanish in an instant. There were days when Laura would find herself staring out the window, wondering where everything had gone wrong, wondering if she could ever trust again. One particularly difficult afternoon, Laura was sitting in the nursery, trying to comfort the twins as they cried. She felt utterly alone, the weight of the world pressing down on her. As she held her babies, she couldn't help but think of the future. What would happen now? What kind of life would she be able to provide for them on her own? How would she explain all of this to them when they were older? And more than anything, she couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of betrayal that seemed to haunt every step she took. Just when it seemed like the pain would consume her, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Laura hesitated, unsure of who could be calling at this hour. She hadn't heard from David since the day he left, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face anyone just yet. But curiosity got the better of her, and she stood up to answer the door. When she opened it, she was met by a familiar face, her best friend, Emily. Emily had been her rock through many of life's challenges, and Laura had always turned to her when things got tough. Emily stepped inside, her arms immediately wrapping around Laura in a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry, Laura," Emily said softly, her voice filled with concern. "I've been trying to reach you. I had to come by. You don't have to go through this alone." Tears welled up in Laura's eyes as she clung to her friend. "I don't know what to do, Emily. He's gone. Just like that. And I'm left here with nothing." Emily gently pulled back, holding Laura at arm's length. "You're not alone, Laura. You have me, and you have those beautiful babies. We'll figure this out together. I know it's hard, but you're stronger than you think. Laura looked at Emily, a faint glimmer of hope flickering in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, she could get through this. She had to. For her children, and for herself. As the days passed, Laura began to find a new sense of resolve. The hurt didn't go away. But she realized she couldn't let it define her. She still had her children to care for, and she wasn't about to let David's betrayal break her. Slowly, she started reaching out to the people she had kept at a distance, the ones who had always been there for her. Emily helped her find the courage to start moving forward, to rebuild her life from the ground up. But as much as she tried to move on, the questions lingered. What had driven David to abandon her? What had changed between them? And most haunting of all, what was he doing now? Was he living a life without her and their children, as if they had never mattered? One evening, after the twins had gone to bed, Laura sat alone in the living room, her mind racing. She thought about how everything had shifted so quickly. She had been blindsided by David's decision, and the weight of it still seemed unbearable. But in the silence of the night, a thought crept into her mind: what if this was the start of something new? What if this was her chance to reclaim her life, to prove to herself and to her children that they were stronger than any betrayal? She didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear: she was done being a victim. No matter how hard it got, no matter how many times she stumbled, she would keep going. For the sake of her children, for the sake of her own sanity, she would rise above this. The storm might have torn apart her life, but it wouldn't define her. And as she sat there in the dim light of her living room, a sense of quiet determination began to take root. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was hers to take. And no matter where it led, she would walk it with strength and grace, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The weeks stretched into months, and with every passing day, Laura found herself confronting the harsh realities of single motherhood. What had once been a shared journey with David now felt like an endless road that she had to walk alone. But there was no time to wallow in the pain of betrayal. Her children needed her, more than ever. As the twins grew, their needs became more demanding, their cries louder, their laughter more precious. Laura clung to those moments of joy, the brief flashes of light that reminded her of the love she had once shared with David, but she also couldn't deny the ever-present shadow of his absence. She was constantly tired. The nights were long, and the days were filled with seemingly endless tasks. She had to get the babies dressed, fed, and settled while managing the house, grocery shopping, and trying to keep herself together emotionally. There were moments when she felt as though she might break under the weight of it all. But then she would see the twins' faces, their innocent smiles, and somehow, it was enough to keep her going. Her friends, particularly Emily, had been a lifeline. Emily's visits were a comfort, a reminder that there were still people in Laura's life who cared. But even Emily couldn't shield her from the overwhelming sense of loneliness that would settle in during the quiet moments. She missed David. Not in the way she used to, but in the way that made her question what had happened, what went wrong. She would often find herself wondering if things could have turned out differently, if there was anything she could have done to make him stay. The pain of abandonment was one that seemed to haunt her every waking hour. And yet, the pain was becoming something different. Not something she wallowed in, but something she used to fuel her determination. For the first time in her life, Laura was forced to truly rely on herself. There was no one else to lean on, no one to share the burden. The weight of responsibility was immense, but with it came a sense of power, a sense of control over her own future. She was no longer the woman who needed someone else to define her. She was the woman who would rise, despite everything. One afternoon, while taking a rare break from the chaos of daily life, Laura sat on the porch and watched the sun begin to set. The twins were napping inside, and for the first time in a long while, she had a few minutes to herself. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the sun soak into her skin. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe without the constant pressure of motherhood weighing on her every move. But even in that brief moment of peace, thoughts of David crept into her mind. What was he doing now? Was he living a life of freedom, unaffected by the consequences of his actions? Had he moved on, or was he struggling in his own way? There were so many questions she couldn't answer, and that lack of closure gnawed at her. But deep down, she knew it wasn't about him anymore. The more she focused on him, the more she lost sight of the life that was right in front of her. It wasn't about understanding why he had left, it was about moving forward. She had spent too many sleepless nights wondering what went wrong, what she could have done differently, but there was no answer. The only answer was in her own actions, in the choices she made moving forward. So, she began to focus on herself, something she had never really done before. She started to find small ways to reclaim her identity, ways to remind herself that she was more than just a mother or a wife. She began taking online courses in graphic design, something she had always been interested in but never had the time to pursue. Slowly, she built a sense of accomplishment, a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to anyone else. She found a community of like-minded people online, and for the first time in months, she felt as though she was part of something bigger than herself. The twins grew, and with their growth came new challenges. Laura had to learn to balance work and motherhood, to find time for herself in a world that constantly demanded more from her. But she was doing it. Every day, she was doing it. There were still bad days, days when the loneliness felt suffocating, when she wished she could pick up the phone and call David, ask him why he had left, or simply vent about the difficulties of raising 2 children on her own. But those days were becoming fewer. She was finding her strength, finding her footing. Then, one evening, as Laura was getting the twins ready for bed, a knock at the door startled her. She had been expecting a quiet night. Emily had mentioned she would drop by later, but this knock didn't sound like her friend. Reluctantly, Laura walked to the door, wondering who it could be. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Standing in front of her was David. His presence seemed to fill the doorway, his posture tense, as if unsure of what kind of reception he would receive. Laura felt a mix of emotions flood through her, anger, confusion, curiosity, and a deep, painful ache that she couldn't quite name. "David," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The twins were in the next room, but she couldn't seem to look away from him. "I know this is unexpected," he said, his voice quieter than she remembered. "But I need to talk to you. I've been thinking about everything, and I realize I've made a huge mistake." Laura's heart raced. She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to slam the door in his face, to tell him that it was too late, that the damage was done. But there was another part of her, an exhausted, vulnerable part, that still longed for the answers. She wanted to hear him explain why, how he could have walked away so easily. "I'm listening," she said, her voice shaky. "But you need to understand, David, this isn't something that can just be fixed with words." David nodded, looking down as if ashamed. I know I can't fix what I've done. But I need you to know that I never stopped caring about you, about the twins. I was just lost. And I left when I should have stayed. I'm sorry. I've been going to therapy, trying to figure things out. And I want to be there for you and the kids. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I need you to know I'm trying to change." Laura's mind was spinning. Could she trust him again? Was this apology genuine, or was it just another attempt to justify his actions? She looked into his eyes, searching for any sign that he was truly remorseful, truly ready to be the man he had once promised to be. For a long moment, there was only silence between them. Finally, Laura spoke, her voice steady but filled with an emotion she couldn't quite hide. "You left us when we needed you the most, David. You can't undo that. But that doesn't mean I'm willing to just forget about everything. David nodded again, a mix of regret and acceptance in his gaze. I don't expect you to forget. I just need a chance to make things right. Laura didn't know what to do with his words. Part of her wanted to walk away, to slam the door and tell him to leave. But another part of her, deep down, wanted to believe that people could change, that perhaps there was room for redemption. But the journey ahead, if there was to be one, would not be an easy one. The road to rebuilding trust, to healing, was long and uncertain. And though she couldn't erase the past, perhaps, just perhaps, there was a glimmer of hope for the future. But that would be a decision for another day. Tonight, the question lingered in the air, unspoken but powerful: could David's presence in their lives really bring healing, or was it just another lie waiting to break them all over again? And for Laura, that was a question she wasn't sure she was ready to answer just yet. Days passed since David's unexpected appearance on Laura's doorstep, and the shock of his sudden return had yet to fully settle. It was as if the earth had shifted beneath her feet, and she was left standing in the aftermath, unsure of what to do next. He had apologized, promised change, but those words, so easy to say, did not erase the years of hurt, the moments when he had abandoned her, left her stranded with newborn twins in the middle of nowhere. The betrayal ran deep, and though part of her wanted to believe in the possibility of redemption, another part felt as though it would be impossible to trust him again. The twins had begun to sense the change in the air, their innocent eyes often searching for the father they had never known. It was heartbreaking for Laura to see their longing, their small hands reaching out in hopes of a reunion that they didn't even understand. She couldn't deny that her heart ached for them, for the family that had once been whole and was now fractured, struggling to put the pieces back together. Every time David called, every time he asked if he could come over, Laura hesitated. She wanted to let him in, to give him a chance to prove he had changed, but fear clung to her like a heavy cloak. She had seen what he was capable of, how easily he had walked away without a second thought, how little he had cared for the family they had built. The memory of that day, driving her to the middle of nowhere, leaving her to fend for herself with newborn twins in tow, still haunted her. She could still hear the sound of the tires on the gravel road, the engine's hum that felt like an eternal farewell. But David was persistent. He called daily, texting and showing up at her door unannounced, apologizing over and over again, trying to prove that he had changed, that he was now a man who understood the gravity of his actions. Slowly, Laura allowed him to visit, but it wasn't without hesitation. Each time he walked through the door, she braced herself for the worst, her guard firmly in place. He would hold the twins, smile, and ask about their day, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was simply trying to make amends for a guilt he could never truly escape. In those early days of David's return, Laura lived in a state of constant tension. She couldn't deny that there was a small part of her that still missed him. They had once shared dreams, a future together, and though their marriage had crumbled, the love they had once known wasn't something that disappeared overnight. The problem wasn't just his abandonment, it was the way he had left, without a single word of explanation. He had simply vanished, leaving her to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. That was the hardest thing to reconcile. It wasn't the leaving, it was the silence, the coldness with which he had severed their bond. But as time passed, something in Laura began to shift. Perhaps it was the way David had started showing up with little gestures of care, bringing groceries, helping with chores, asking her how her day had gone. He wasn't demanding anything from her, he wasn't trying to push her to forgive him immediately. He was simply present. And though she resented the fact that he had taken so long to realize what he had lost, she couldn't deny that the change in him, the quiet determination, began to wear away at her walls. One evening, after a particularly long and exhausting day, Laura sat on the couch, her head in her hands. The twins were asleep, and for a moment, she allowed herself to sink into the silence. But then the doorbell rang. It was David again. He had been showing up more often lately, and she was beginning to feel conflicted. She had hoped his presence would fade with time, but instead, it seemed to linger in the house like a shadow. When she opened the door, he stood there with a small bag in his hands. "I brought you something," he said softly, his eyes wary. Laura didn't know what to make of it. She hadn't asked for anything, hadn't shown any sign of wanting him there. But despite herself, she stepped aside to let him in. "What's this?" she asked, glancing at the bag. He smiled faintly. "Just something for you, for all the things you do. You've been so strong, Laura. I don't think I've ever really understood how hard this is for you, for both of you." Laura felt a pang in her chest. This wasn't the David she had known. The David she remembered would have never shown up with a simple gesture like this. His arrogance had always overshadowed any sense of empathy, any awareness of what she was going through. But now? Now he was different. And the thing that scared Laura the most was the possibility that it wasn't an act. It was real. She took the bag from his hands and opened it slowly, revealing a collection of self-care products, bath salts, scented candles, a journal, and a small card that read, "For moments when you need to breathe." Tears welled up in Laura's eyes. She had become so accustomed to doing everything herself, to feeling like there was no one in her corner. She had put everything into her children, into surviving, into making sure they were happy and healthy. But somewhere along the way, she had forgotten about herself. Forgotten that she needed care, too. She closed her eyes, fighting the lump in her throat. "Thank you," she said softly, unable to say anything more. David's face softened, and for a moment, it was as if the years between them had melted away. He stepped closer to her, his voice quiet but earnest. "I want to be here for you. I want to be the person I should have been. I know I can't undo the past, but if you let me, I can start making it right." Laura didn't know how to respond. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that things could get better, that they could rebuild the life they had once shared. But the weight of the past was heavy on her heart. She had given him everything, and he had left. What if history repeated itself? What if the trust she was slowly starting to rebuild was broken once again? David could see the hesitation in her eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I know I don't deserve that. But I'll keep proving to you that I'm here, that I'm not going anywhere. The decision is yours, but I'll wait for however long it takes." For a moment, Laura stood there, feeling as though the ground beneath her was shifting again. She looked at him, really looked at him, and in that moment, for the first time in years, she felt something stir deep within her. Hope. Cautious, fragile, but hope nonetheless. It wouldn't be easy. She knew that. Healing would take time, and trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. But maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and emotional hurdles. But for the first time since he left, Laura felt a small flicker of possibility. The future was no longer a path she walked alone. And in that uncertain silence between them, Laura realized that the hardest part of all, the part that had held her back, was finally letting go of the anger, the resentment, and the fear. She had to trust herself first, trust that she had the strength to make the right choice for herself and her children. And that decision, whether to open her heart to David again, was one that only she could make. But for now, all she could do was take a breath and let herself feel the hope that, for once, things might turn out differently. The weeks that followed were a blur of emotions, the air thick with the weight of decisions unmade and promises yet to be tested. David continued to visit, his presence lingering like the scent of rain after a long drought. His gestures were small but consistent, each one seemingly aimed at proving his sincerity, that he was no longer the man who had once driven Laura and their newborn twins into the wilderness without a second thought. But no matter how many candles he lit, or thoughtful gifts he brought, there remained a void between them, a chasm that couldn't be easily crossed. Laura wrestled with herself. The anger was still there, a quiet, steady burn under the surface. The scar of betrayal ran deeper than she had initially realized. She had spent so many nights alone, replaying the worst moments in her mind. The sound of the engine fading away as he left them behind, the gnawing fear as she tried to calm the crying babies, feeling like the world had closed in around her. How could she trust him again? How could she believe in the man standing before her now, when the version of him that had driven them into the unknown seemed so far removed from who he was trying to become? But she couldn't deny the change in him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at times, but it was there. He wasn't the man who had abandoned her. He wasn't the man who had left her stranded. He was different. Whether it was guilt, or the realization of what he had lost, David seemed genuinely committed to making amends. But no matter how many times she caught a glimpse of the man he could be, the shadows of his past lingered in every interaction. The twins, though still too young to understand the complexity of adult relationships, were beginning to take note of the subtle changes. They reached for David, their tiny hands grasping at his fingers when he entered the room. It was impossible for Laura not to feel the pull of their need for a father, a yearning she had tried to fill on her own, but never fully could. There were moments when she saw a flicker of the man she had once loved in David's eyes, and her heart softened. But then the reality of their history came crashing back in. Laura's friends, too, had their doubts. Some of them rallied behind her, expressing hope that she could find happiness again with David, but others were more cautious. They had watched her suffer, and they feared that letting him back into their lives would only lead to more heartbreak. They urged her to take her time, to be sure of her choice before making any life-altering decisions. They saw the anguish she was trying so desperately to hide behind a smile, and they worried that opening herself up to David again might destroy everything she had worked so hard to rebuild. As the weeks turned into months, the tension between them became a constant presence in their home. Laura's mind was a battlefield, torn between the part of her that wanted to believe in redemption, and the part of her that couldn't shake the fear of history repeating itself. She could see how hard David was trying, how much he wanted to be there for her and the twins. But was it enough? Could she ever truly forgive him for what he had done? Then came the turning point. One rainy afternoon, as the clouds hung low over the town, David asked her a question that seemed innocent enough at first, but would ultimately change everything. They were sitting on the couch, the twins napping in the next room, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the air between them felt calm. There was no tension, no unspoken accusations or lingering anger. Just the soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the sound of raindrops against the windows. "Do you think we can fix this?" David asked, his voice low, almost unsure. Laura's heart skipped a beat. The question was loaded, one that carried the weight of everything they had been through. Could they fix it? Could she really forgive him, forget the betrayal, and allow their family to heal? She looked at him, the man who had once been her everything, and saw the vulnerability in his eyes. For a moment, she wasn't just seeing the man who had hurt her, but the man who was trying to make things right. "I don't know," Laura replied quietly, her hands gripping the edge of the couch. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you for what you did, David. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget the pain you caused me, the fear I felt when you left us." He nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I can't undo the past, no matter how hard I try. But I want to be here. I want to make it right, for you, for the twins. I'll keep fighting, Laura. I'll keep proving that I'm not the man who left you behind." The sincerity in his voice hit her like a wave, and for the first time in a long time, Laura felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they couldn't fix everything. Maybe the past would always linger like a scar, reminding them of what had happened. But perhaps, just perhaps, they could begin to heal. Slowly, piece by piece. It wouldn't be easy, and it would take time. But maybe they could start over, not as the people they once were, but as the people they had become through all the pain, all the loss, and all the growth. Days turned into weeks, and Laura found herself allowing David back into their lives more and more. There were still moments of doubt, moments when she questioned whether she was making the right choice. But with each passing day, she began to see the change in him more clearly. He wasn't perfect, and he would never be able to undo the damage he had caused, but he was trying. And that effort, that commitment, meant more than anything. The twins, too, seemed to sense the shift. They giggled when David played with them, and their tiny hands reached for him as if they were discovering their father for the first time. It was hard for Laura to deny the joy she saw in their eyes when he was around. The family she had once feared would never be whole again was beginning to take shape once more. But despite the warmth that began to fill the house, Laura still struggled with the weight of her emotions. She wasn't sure if the love she had once felt for David could ever return in full. She wasn't sure if she could ever forget the hurt, the betrayal, the fear. But she was willing to try. And that, in itself, was a victory. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, Laura sat by the window, watching as David played with the twins in the yard. The laughter of her children filled the air, and for a moment, everything felt right. The pain, the loss, the uncertainty, those things still lingered, but they no longer consumed her. She could breathe again. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe it wasn't the happily ever after she had once dreamed of, but it was a new chapter. And that was enough. As she watched David with the twins, she realized that it wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, to grow from it, and to build something stronger in its wake. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges ahead. But Laura had learned something important through all the heartache. She was capable of more than she had ever imagined. She could forgive, she could heal, and above all, she could move forward. And so, they did, one day at a time. It had been nearly a year since that fateful day when David had driven Laura and their newborn twins out into the wilderness, abandoning them at a moment when they needed him the most. The town had moved on with its usual rhythm, but for Laura, every passing day was a reminder of the pain that had once ruled her life. The betrayal, the abandonment, and the fear she had felt were not easily forgotten. Yet, something had shifted over the months. It was subtle, like the changing of seasons, but it was there, a quiet transformation that no one could quite explain. David had kept his promise to try. He had made mistakes, of course. He still carried the weight of his past actions, and there were times when Laura wondered if it was enough. Was it enough to erase the stain of his betrayal? Was it enough to rebuild a trust that had been shattered in an instant? And yet, with each small act of kindness, each moment of patience, each effort to make things right, she saw something different in him. Not perfection, he would never be perfect, but a man who was striving to be better. Laura had always believed in second chances, but this was different. This wasn't just about giving David another shot, it was about giving herself the opportunity to heal. She couldn't change the past, but she could choose how to respond to the present and future. The journey was hers to take, not just for her own peace of mind, but for the sake of their children as well. The twins, now crawling and babbling, were starting to understand the world around them. They saw their father as a constant presence in their lives, their little faces lighting up every time David entered the room. They had no concept of the pain that had once fractured their family. To them, David was simply Daddy, the man who played with them, fed them, and made them laugh. And maybe, in their innocent eyes, that was enough. But for Laura, the journey wasn't so simple. She was still grappling with the ghosts of the past. How could she forgive David completely when the scars of what he had done ran so deep? How could she ever forget the terror of being alone, vulnerable, and scared, with no one to help her but herself? It wasn't a question she had an immediate answer for. There were days when she doubted herself, when she felt the weight of her emotions crash down upon her in waves. But there were also days when she allowed herself to hope. Hope that things could get better, that they could rebuild, and that the family they had once been could find a way back to each other. David, for his part, had shown no signs of giving up. He had seen the pain in Laura's eyes, felt the cold distance between them that no amount of gifts or words could erase. But he kept coming back. He kept showing up, day after day, even when the road seemed impossibly long. He was determined to prove to her, and to himself, that he could be the man she needed. He had come to understand the depth of his mistake, not just as a husband, but as a father. He couldn't undo the past, but he could be present in the future. He could try to build something new, brick by brick, even if the foundation was cracked. One evening, as the sky began to darken, Laura sat on the porch, watching the twins play in the yard. David was on the swing set with them, his laughter mingling with theirs as he pushed them higher and higher into the evening air. The sight of her family, complete in its own way, filled her heart with a bittersweet joy. This wasn't the life she had once imagined, but it was a life that had been rebuilt from the ashes of their broken past. David joined her on the porch, his eyes soft as he watched the children. "They're growing up so fast," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Laura nodded, her eyes on the twins. "They are. It feels like just yesterday they were so tiny, and now they're running around, laughing, getting into everything." David's hand found hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. "I'm sorry, Laura. I'll never be able to take back what I did. But I'm here now, and I'll keep doing whatever it takes to make things right." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of everything they had been through. Laura didn't know if she could ever fully forgive him, not completely. But there, in that quiet moment, as the wind rustled the leaves of the trees and the sound of her children's laughter filled the air, she realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't always about erasing the past. Sometimes, it was about finding a way to live with it, to grow from it, and to choose to move forward. The following months were filled with small moments of healing, shared meals, late-night talks, and quiet walks through the neighborhood. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And that, in itself, was enough. David continued to put in the effort, never taking it for granted that he had been given another chance. And Laura began to see him in a new light, not as the man who had betrayed her, but as the man who was fighting for their family. She still had moments of doubt, but they became less frequent. The love she had once felt for him was beginning to resurface, though it was different now. It wasn't the naive love of the past, but a more tempered, wiser love, one that had been tested by fire. There were, of course, moments of tension. There were arguments about trust, about what the future would look like, about how to raise their children in a world that often seemed unfair and unforgiving. But with each challenge, they learned to communicate better, to listen more, to compromise. They were no longer the same people who had made the decisions that had led them to this point. They had been changed by the experiences they had gone through, both individually and as a family. And though they couldn't forget the past, they were learning how to embrace the future together. As the twins celebrated their first birthday, a sense of quiet joy settled over the family. They had made it through the storm, and though the scars of the past were still there, they no longer defined them. They had weathered the hardest part, and now, they were ready to begin a new chapter in their lives. David held one of the twins in his arms, and Laura smiled as she watched him. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of peace. It wasn't the peace she had once imagined, but it was the kind of peace that comes after a storm has passed. It was the kind of peace that comes from knowing that, no matter how hard life gets, they could face it together. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, there would be struggles, and there would be days when they questioned whether they had made the right choices. But as they stood there, on the precipice of their new life, they knew one thing for certain: they had each other. And with that, they could face anything. As the twins blew out their first birthday candles, their giggles ringing through the air, Laura realized that the family they had once feared would be broken beyond repair was beginning to heal. It wasn't the perfect ending to their story, but it was enough. It was a story of resilience, of forgiveness, and of the unwavering power of love. And as they walked forward, hand in hand, they knew that the road ahead, though uncertain, would always lead them back to each other.